One of the problems with corruption is that you know when you start, you don't know when you stop.
The prospect of going to jail is very real these days.
Bribery and corruption is like a cancer that eats away at the very fabric of society.
The basic elements of an FCPA violation are as follows. Corrupt intent or purpose. There has to be an offer, a payment, a promise to pay, or an authorization of a payment to a third party. The third party needs to be a foreign public official.
Public corruption is the top priority of the criminal division of the FBI.
It's a bit of a Russian roulette thing, I think, because you never know if you're going to be the company that gets caught.
Just don't pay.
There was a time when making payoffs and buying contracts seemed like a good idea to the people who ran large corporations. But in 1977, the U.S. government was the first to take extraordinary measures to discourage these illicit transactions by passing the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. More than 30 years later, commercial bribery is a crime almost everywhere. I'm Alexandra Rogge, president of Trace. This video will explain more fully the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and similar international laws. As regulatory agencies ratchet up enforcement with more staff and enhanced international cooperation, companies must ensure that their employees are not violating anti-bribery laws by making inappropriate payments. You really don't want to be the target of one of these investigations. My goal is to show you that well-run companies can be compliant and remain competitive in the global business environment. In part one of this video, we will focus on U.S. law, which remains the greatest source of prosecutions. The FCPA made it a crime for U.S. companies and foreign companies with a connection to the United States to pay foreign officials in order to get or keep business.
Compliance with anti-bribery regulations has become an important corporate priority. Multinational companies must find ways to compete internationally without breaking their own anti-bribery laws or the laws of the countries in which they operate.
Any company that's new to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or any anti-corruption measures really needs one piece of advice. Get up to speed fast. If you don't get up to speed fast, the government has a whole variety of tools and they will find you. And if your compliance program is not up to par, you're going to be punished for it.
It's critical to have an anti-bribery program in today's environment, or for that matter, any environment. First of all, it's the right way to do business. We've found that dealing honestly, straightforwardly, and in compliance with the law makes us more competitive. If you have a culture of bribery, you will have a culture of dishonesty internally. And what kind of people does that attract? It attracts dishonest people.
Companies have to find ways to market aggressively to win business without compromising their ethical standards.
It's very hard in this day and age, whether you're an American company or a company that trades on any of the Western European or U.S. exchanges. 30 years after the passage of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, 10 years after the passage of the OECD Convention Against Corruption, there's almost no excuse today not to have a thriving compliance program.
And beyond simply adopting an anti-bribery policy, it's important to be sure it is well-tailored and with sufficient controls to be effective.
There's a direct correlation in my experience, not a precise one, but a direct correlation between those that have invested in compliance and those who haven't and end up being prosecuted. So if you invest in a compliance program, I can't guarantee it, but I can give you a pretty high level of certainty it means that you're less likely to become the target of a government investigation.
The goal is to find a balance between compliance and competitiveness. A company must be able to conduct business in a transparent and appropriate manner, take prudent precautions, and work with well-vetted partners. But this is not as simple as it sounds.
You can't have a culture in which you are hidebound to too much process, in which everybody thinks you're the cops if you're involved in compliance or integrity programs. So the only way to deal with that balance is by having it built into your processes. Anti-bribery programs are a business process like any other process, and they have to be seen as that. In addition, the leadership has to own it.
Brackett Denniston is Senior Vice President and General Counsel at General Electric. Multinational companies like GE routinely operate in more than 100 countries, including many that have a long history of corruption. But these days, it is essential to steer clear of any actions anywhere which might be construed as illegal.
Due diligence is the best means of protecting yourself. That means educating your third parties, and that means all kinds of third parties. You've got to have good checks and balances. Are we, in fact, executing on our implementing procedures? Do we have misses? And lastly, when you have a problem, and everybody has an occasional problem in a complicated company, you have to deal with it forthrightly, rapidly.
To remain competitive, companies today need to be in every corner of the world, even in places where corruption may be commonplace.
Companies really aren't pulling out. And so, because of that, companies don't have a choice, in my opinion, but to really focus on compliance and to train their employees well and train them regularly.
It's pretty clear that sliding a briefcase full of cash to a foreign official in some darkened back corner in order to close a deal is illegal. But not everything is so obvious. There are gray areas that can be confusing and vague.
The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and all of these statutes are so complicated these days that a business opportunity, some sort of a free trip, something that somebody might not think of at all as a bribe, is in fact a violation of federal criminal law that can land an employee and the company in jail.
That's why it's important to be specific about your company's policies. Most employees, given management support and pointed in the right direction, will do the right thing.
Nobody in any company I've ever prosecuted or defended woke up one morning and said, I'm going to pay a bribe, I'm going to violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. They find themselves in a difficult position. They make a bad judgment to try to get some business, and they find themselves on the short end of an investigation. If they understand the red flags, the warning signs, when they wake up in the morning, they'll end the day in a much better place than they might have.
The FCPA was the first roadmap for determining what constitutes legal behavior in this area. The law was born out of one of America's greatest political scandals.
The origins of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act lie in the Watergate era. If you go back to the 1970s, at that time, the Watergate Special Counsel's Office was investigating alleged improper campaign contributions to the committee to re-elect President Nixon.
Mark Mendelson is the Deputy Chief in the Fraud Division at the Department of Justice.
At the time, what was uncovered was offshore slush funds were being utilized by companies to make illegal campaign contributions. So the SEC commenced an inquiry into the issue of illicit payments being made by U.S. companies. And as a result of their inquiry, some 400 to 500 companies came forward, most of them voluntarily, to share with the SEC the fact that they too had been using offshore slush funds for a variety of purposes.
But when the SEC looked closely at the uses of these offshore slush funds,
what they discovered was that they were being used for a variety of illicit purposes, including fairly widespread corruption of foreign public officials for business purposes. This discovery resulted ultimately in the enactment in Congress of what we now know as the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
The FCPA is structured around two core sets of provisions, the anti-bribery provisions and the accounting provisions, which pertain to a company's books, records, and internal controls.
These accounting provisions only pertain to what we call issuers, which are essentially companies that are publicly traded on U.S. exchanges. The anti-bribery provisions apply much more broadly, not only to issuers, but to U.S. companies, to U.S. persons, and even to non-U.S. companies and persons where there is a connection to the territory of the United States.
We view books and records and internal controls provisions as highly important parts of the FCPA. What you'll typically find is that companies will not disclose on their books that the actual cost that they've incurred was for payments of bribes. Internal controls really focuses more on a system that's in place to be able to perhaps do what management requires in terms of the disposition of assets, in terms of following management's directives. In many cases, for example, internal controls violations really constitute a company's failure to put in place a system that will make it less likely that individuals will violate the FCPA.
The anti-bribery provisions have 5 basic elements.
First of all, there has to be a corrupt intent or purpose. Secondly, there needs to be a payment, an offer to pay, a promise to pay, or an authorization of payment. Third, there needs to be a thing of value that's being offered or paid. The recipient, of course, needs to be a foreign public official. There needs to be a quid pro quo, an exchange of the thing of value for some act in return.
Bribes are not always monetary, cash. They can include almost anything of value.
It could be a car, it could be a yacht, it could be a villa in the south of Spain, it could be the payment of tuition for the foreign official's student to attend college. It could even be prostitution services. There are a wide variety of things that are things of value that can make out that element of the offense.
According to the statute, a payment is illicit if it is meant to buy your company an inappropriate advantage. It doesn't have to actually result in new business.
It could be a private contract if you are, for example, paying bribes to tax authorities or to customs officials in a way that saves your company costs and makes you profitable and permits you to obtain private contracts. So this element of the offense is broader than it might seem on its face, but the department's position has always been that this element should be construed broadly.
Corrupt intent is one of the elements that contribute to a violation of the FCPA. Corrupt intent can be inferred from all of the circumstances surrounding a deal, although email often plays a role.
If somebody is explicitly stating in an email what the purpose of their payment is, that's quite easy. But one can also infer corrupt intent from the entirety of the circumstances in a particular case. And so we go about establishing the corrupt intent element in a variety of ways depending on the facts and circumstances that we're dealing with.
Gifts during holidays, charitable contributions, and customary business meals are gray areas under the FCPA. But when offering these, ask yourself, am I trying to improperly influence this decision maker? And would I be comfortable if this entertainment or gift ended up on the front page of the newspaper at home or abroad?
Traditional entertainment, business entertainment is fine, but I think as a practical way to gather things, a practical way to understand things, if you wouldn't submit the reimbursement on your own form, don't give it to a government official.
Questions often arise about doing favors for foreign officials, employing their relatives, or assisting with visas. Where does a company draw the line?
There really are a wide variety of things that, again, so long as they have value from the subjective perspective of the foreign official, can make out this element of the offense.
It's clear from recent scandals that one classic bribery technique is to use a third-party intermediary, a family member or commercial agent, to hide the criminal transaction.
They can be financial intermediaries, they can be third-party consultants, they can be company employees, they can be professional services firms, they may be witting participants in a scheme, and they may be unwitting participants in a scheme to bribe a foreign public official.
Corporate travel is another common area of abuse. How do anti-bribery laws address that? Especially if a company wants to sponsor a trip for foreign officials to visit their headquarters or operating plants for legitimate marketing and promotional purposes.
There's nothing improper about bringing an official on a legitimate trip to inspect a factory, to look at a company's products. That can be perfectly appropriate. It's when that trip becomes an excuse for side trips. It's when that trip is a half a day and tacked on to the beginning and end of the trip are shopping trips and excursions for purely leisure purposes that are also provided at the company's expense. That's when there are problems.
Global businesses must deal with these legal ambiguities every day. They have to find a balance that enables them to work to a high ethical standard while remaining competitive. Companies bear the brunt of anti-bribery enforcement. The enforcement agencies tackle the supply side, companies that offer or pay bribes, and not the demand side, the government officials that demand or accept them.
FCPA enforcement is principally about tackling the supply side of the foreign bribery problem. But there is a demand side of the equation, and that's important as well. And the U.S. government broadly and the Justice Department in particular do take significant efforts to work on the demand side of the problem. We provide technical assistance and training to foreign law enforcement counterparts, to anti-corruption agencies that are working hard in the developing world to deal with their domestic corruption problem.
Many of us working to end commercial bribery in the global marketplace are confident that it is possible to do business successfully and ethically.
I believe that you can do business anywhere in the world, legally and successfully. Now, I believe in some places it takes a fair bit of resources, oversight. It takes a lot of company energy in terms of training and review of a whole variety of transactions. But I don't believe there's any country in the world that a company cannot do business in, even if the corruption climate is very, very significant.
With the U.S. Department of Justice and the SEC keeping a close watch on U.S. companies, it is increasingly likely that if a company is paying bribes or engaging in any corporate malfeasance, those involved will be caught.
In part 2 of Toxic Transactions, we take a closer look at a few companies that have found themselves on the wrong side of the law, and some that have faced and survived a criminal investigation.